The footage spread faster than anyone had predicted within 6 hours of the incident at Threshold Junction. The recording had been viewed over 2 million times across 3 different sectors. Within 2 days it had reached the core worlds and been translated into 47 languages and analyzed by military academies on a dozen planets. Within a week, the human who killed a Vrekari warrior without leaving his wheelchair had become the subject of debates and discussions throughout known. Space Tasic did not know any of this because he was busy escorting Alex's cargo through the shattered reach and had no time for network access. The job was straightforward but required constant vigilance because the reach was home to pirates and desperate beings who would kill for the valuable medical supplies in Helix's hold. Vorik proved useful during the journey. He had been trained as a warrior from childhood, and his 4 arms made him effective at tasks that would have required 2 humans, and his knowledge of Rakari space helped them avoid several dangerous situations. He also asked questions constantly. How did your species survive without natural weapons? He wanted to know during one long jump through hyperspace. You have no claws or fangs or venom, and your hide is so thin that a child could cut it. We made weapons, Tasic explained. First from stone and bone, and then from metal, and eventually from the same materials we used to build starships, but before the weapons. Vorik pressed. How did you hunt? We ran, Tasic said. Humans are not fast, but we can run for hours without stopping, and we would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. The Vrekari's scale shifted to the purple of disbelief. That cannot be true. He said, it is called persistence hunting, Tasic replied. And some human cultures still practice it today. He smiled at Vorik's expression. Your people are sprinters, he said. You are designed for short bursts of incredible speed and power. But you tire quickly in sustained effort. That is accurate. Vorik admitted. Humans are marathoners, Tasic continued. We are designed to endure and to keep going long after others would have stopped, and that same stubbornness applies to more than just physical activity. Like your injury, Vorik said quietly, like my injury. Tasic agreed. Any reasonable being would have accepted the limitations of a severed spine and found a way to live within those limitations. But you did not. I could not. Tasic said, it is not in my nature, and I do not think it is in the nature of my species. They completed the job without serious incident and delivered Alex's cargo to a medical station in the Kirani system, and the grateful administrator paid them a bonus because the supplies would save hundreds of livish Alex. Bid them farewell with obvious relief that the journey was over and no more Vrekari warriors had challenged his terrifying human. Security consultant Tasic and Vorik found themselves standing in the docking bay of the medical station with no particular destination in mind. What will you do now? Vorik asked. Find another job, Tasic said. It is what I always do. And me? The young Vrekari asked. Do you still want me watching your back? Tasic considered the question. You have potential, he said finally. But you lack training in the things that matter most. What things? Patience. Tasic said. Discipline and the ability to see strength in unexpected forms. He reached into a compartment on his wheelchair and withdrew a small data chip. This contains the military history and combat philosophy of my species, he said. It includes works by strategists and warriors from thousands of years of human civilization. He held it out to Vorik. Study it, he said. Learn from it, and in 1 year find me again. Vorik took the chip and examined it with obvious uncertainty. 1 year is a long time, he said. Humans live short lives compared to many species, Tasic replied. We learn to value time differently, and 1 year spent learning is 1 year invested in becoming something greater. What if I cannot find you? Vorik asked. Then you will not have learned enough to be useful to me anyway, Tasic said, and there was something like humor in his voice. The young Vrekari stood straighter and his scales shifted to the deep green of determination. "I will find you," he said, "and when I do, I will show you that I have learned everything this chip contains." "I look forward to it," Tyzik said. They parted ways in the docking bay, and Tyzik did not look back as he wheeled toward the section of the station where he could find transport to his next job. The following months brought more contracts and more challenges and more encounters with beings who underestimated the human in the wheelchair each time. Tyzik responded with the same patience and precision that had killed Keseth, and each time the footage spread further and added to the growing mythology of human capability. He heard stories about himself that were mostly false and a few that were entirely true, and he ignored all of them because reputation was a tool and not an end in itself. What mattered was the work. What mattered was proving every day that the injury which had tried to end his life had instead made him something new, and perhaps something more dangerous than he had ever been before. The galaxy was slowly learning what humanity was capable of. A consortium report noted that applications to human combat training programs had increased by 40% since the incident at Threshold Junction. A Verkari analyst published a paper arguing that his species had fundamentally misunderstood human psychology and needed to revise their assessment of the young species. A Moradi Entertainment Network produced a documentary about human resilience that became the most watched program in their history. None of this changed Tysik's daily routine. He woke and he trained and he worked and he slept. And he did it all from a wheelchair that had become as much a part of him as his own hands. 1 year after the incident at Threshold Junction, he received a message from an unknown sender. It contained only coordinates and a time and a single word in Verkari that translated roughly as "ready." Tyzik smiled when he read had work to do in that sector anyway, and it would cost him nothing to make a small detour. The galaxy was vast and full of beings who still looked at him and saw only a broken human who could not walk. They were wrong. They would always be wrong, and Tyzik was patient enough to prove it to every single one of them. If that was what it took, he activated his wheelchair and headed for the docking bay. There was always another job waiting, and always another lesson to teach, and he had learned a long time ago that the best teachers were the ones who never stopped being students themselves. The stars waited beyond the station's hull, and the future waited beyond the stars, and young Tyzik waited for neither of them. He went out to meet them instead. Vorik drank the amber liquid, and his scales flickered with surprise at the taste. "This is stronger than I expected," he said. "Humans call it whiskey," Tyzik replied. "It is made from fermented grain and aged in wooden containers, and it has been helping my species deal with difficult situations for hundreds of years." The young Verkari set down his glass and studied the human across from him with obvious fascination. "I have seen warriors fight my entire life," he said. "I have seen masters of combat from a dozen species demonstrate their skills, and I have never seen anyone move the way you moved." "What specifically surprised you?" Tyzik asked. "Everything," Vorik said. "The speed and the power and the precision, but most of all the fact that you did it without standing up." Tyzik nodded and took a sip of his own drink. "Let me explain something about human physiology," he said, "because I think it will help you understand." Around them, the cantina was slowly returning to normal as patrons resumed their conversations, and the bartender cleaned up the broken glass, and the tension gradually drained from the air. But many eyes still watched their table, and many recording devices were still active. Humans evolved on a planet that is classified as a Category 4 death world. Tyzik began. "Our gravity is heavy, and our atmosphere is corrosive, and our ecosystem is filled with predators and parasites and poisonous creatures of every description." "I have heard this," Vorik said. "Many species call your planet a nightmare." "It is," Tyzik agreed. "And surviving there made us into something unusual by galactic standards." He held up his hand and made a fist. Human grip strength is approximately 3 times greater than the galactic average, he said. Our ancestors needed strong hands to climb trees and use tools, and eventually to strangle predators that got too close. He tapped his abdomen. Our core muscles are dense and powerful because we evolved as bipeds and needed to stabilize our upright posture while running and throwing and carrying heavy loads. But your legs, Vorik said. Surely the loss of your legs diminishes your capability. Less than you might think, Tyzik replied. When I lost the use of my legs, I lost my mobility and my speed and my ability to kick and brace myself. He shrugged. But I did not lose my hands or my arms or my chest or my back or my core. And those are the parts of my body that generate power for close combat. But the technique, Vorik pressed. How did you generate enough torque to break my uncle's neck from a seated position? Tyzik considered how to explain. Imagine a spring that has been compressed. He said finally, imagine that all the energy that would normally flow into movement and footwork and body positioning has instead been redirected into a single explosive rotation. He demonstrated by twisting his upper body, and Vorik's scales flickered as he recognized the mechanics of what had happened. You used your chair as an anchor, the Vriakuri said with dawning understanding. Instead of stepping into the strike, you braced against the seat and channeled everything through your center. Exactly, Tyzik said. I spent 2 years developing techniques specifically designed for seated combat, and I practiced them thousands of times until they became as natural as breathing. Moradi merchant approached their table with a nervous expression. Forgive the interruption, she said, but I must ask if what you just demonstrated was a common human skill. Tyzik shook his head. No, he said honestly. Most humans would not be capable of what I did, and I could not have done it before my injury forced me to develop new methods. The merchant seemed both relieved and disappointed by this answer. Still, she said, the footage from today will spread quickly, and it will change how many species perceive your kind. She moved away, and Tyzik watched her go with a thoughtful expression. She is correct, Vorik said. By tomorrow, this recording will be on every network in the sector, and by next week, it will have reached the core worlds. I did not fight your uncle for publicity, Tyzik said. I know, Vorik replied. You fought him because he gave you no other choice, and that may be the most important part of the story. Another patron approached their table, and this one was a grizzled Tellurian with cybernetic limbs and scars that suggested decades of combat experience. I saw what you did, the Tellurian said, and I want you to know that it reminded me of something a human told me once. What was that? Tyzik asked. He said that humans are not the strongest species or the fastest species or the most advanced species, the Tellurian recounted. But they are the most stubborn, and stubbornness can compensate for almost any disadvantage. The old warrior nodded respectfully and walked away. More patrons came forward over the next hour, and each of them had a story to share about humans. They had encountered a Galaxian trader, spoke of a human pilot who had flown her damaged ship through an asteroid field with half her navigation systems offline because her cargo included medicine for a plague outbreak. A Moradi engineer described working alongside a human technician who had refused to sleep for 3 days straight until they solved a reactor problem that threatened to kill everyone on their station. A young Vakari from a different clan admitted that his people had begun studying human history and were disturbed by what they found. Your species has survived ice ages and plagues and nuclear weapons, he said with something like fear in his voice. You kill each other by the millions and then rebuild and grow stronger, and we do not understand how that is possible. Neither do we sometimes, Tyzik admitted. But we keep going anyway. Vorik listened to all of these stories with growing fascination. You are not like other species, he said finally. You do not accept limitations the way we do. Perhaps Tyzik said. Or perhaps every species has individuals who refuse to accept what others tell them is possible. He looked at the young Vakari. You stayed when your companions fled. He said, you chose curiosity over safety, and that suggests you might be one of those individuals. Yourself. Varric's scales shifted to a warm orange that indicated pleasure at the compliment. What happens now? He asked. I cannot return to my clan after what has happened here, and I do not know where else to go. Tyzik considered the question. I am meeting a client here, he said. A trader named Helix, who hired me to escort his cargo through dangerous space, and if you need work, I could use someone to watch my back. You would trust me, Varric said with surprise. After I came here with the warriors who meant to kill you, you are not responsible for their choices. Tyzik replied. Only for your own, and your choices today have been good ones. The doors to the cantina opened, and a nervous-looking Palaxian hurried inside and scanned the room, his eye cluster fixed on Tyzik, and he went pale. You are the human, he said, the one from the recording that everyone is sharing. I am Yun Tyzik. The human confirmed. You must be Helix. The Palaxian looked at the blood stains on the floor and then at the Vakari sitting across from Tyzik. I had heard there was an incident, he said weakly. Perhaps we should discuss the job somewhere more private. Tyzik finished his drink and set the glass on the table. This is Varric, he said. He will be joining us as additional security. Helix looked at the Vakari with obvious uncertainty. Is that wise? He asked. Probably not, Tyzik admitted. But wisdom is overrated. He activated his wheelchair and began moving toward the door, and Varric fell into step beside him. The movement was so fast that most of the witnesses would later disagree about what exactly happened at Tizik's left-hand shot upward and clamped around Kessa's throat with a symphony grip that crushed scales and compressed windpipe and locked the Vakari warrior in place before he could react. At the same instant, his right hand hooked behind Kessa's head and grabbed the ridge of bone at the base of his skull, and Tyzik rotated. The power came from his core just as he had described, and it flowed through his shoulders and arms like a wave of controlled violence, and the torque he generated from his seated position would have been impossible for anyone who had not spent 2 years training for exactly this moment. Kiseth's neck was strong by Vakari standards, and Vakari standards were formidable. It did not matter. The crack was loud, enough to silence every other sound in the cantina, and it echoed off the metal walls and seemed to hang in the air long after it should have. Fade Keseth's body went limp instantly, and his blade clattered to the floor, and his scales faded to the dull gray of death. Tyzik released his grip and let the corpse fall beside his wheelchair. Elapsed time from first movement to last was less than 2 seconds. The 3 younger Vakari stood frozen with their hands on their weapons and their scales cycling through colors so rapidly that they seemed to strobe. They had watched their leader killed by a cripple who never left his chair, and their minds could not process what their eyes had witnessed. The cantina remained absolutely silent. The Marathi bartender had dropped the glass she was pretending to clean, and it lay shattered on the floor behind her counter, and she made no move to pick it up. The Palaxian merchant near the door had lowered his tentacles from his eye cluster, and all 7 of his eyes were fixed on the human, with expressions that might have been terror or awe, or both. The 2 Marathi traders who had been placing bets stared at each other, and neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge that they had both lost. Tyzik looked down at the body beside his wheelchair, and then up at the 3 remaining Vakari. I speak your language, he said. Imperfect, Vakari. I understood every word you said when you entered this establishment. The youngest of the 3 made a strangled sound that might have been a curse or a prayer. I heard you call me a broken thing, Tyzik continued in that same calm voice. I heard you suggest that someone should kill me as a mercy, and I heard you laugh about it. His eyes moved from one Vakari to the next, and none of them could meet his gaze. On Earth we have a saying about still waters, Tyzik said. We say that they run deep, and that the surface tells you nothing about what lies beneath. He gestured at the body on the floor. Your leader looked at me and saw weakness because I cannot walk, he said. He assumed that my injury made me helpless, and he believed that killing me would prove his strength. The oldest of the three remaining Vakari was shaking, and his scales had settled into the pale blue of fear. He was wrong. Tyzik said simply. He reached down and picked up Kesev's fallen blade and examined it briefly before setting it on the table in front of him. You have 3 choices, he said. You can attack me and join your leader on the floor, and I promise you that outcome is certain regardless of how many arms you have. The 3 Vakari did not move. You can leave peacefully and take his body with you and never cross my path again. Tyzik continued. That would be the intelligent choice. He paused and let the silence stretch. Or you can sit down and buy me a new drink to replace the one your leader spilled, and we can have a conversation about why everything you think you know about humans is wrong. The oldest Vakari took a step backward, and his hand dropped away from his weapon. I choose to leave, he said in a voice that cracked. We will take Keseth and go. Acceptable, Tyzik said. But what about your companions? The middle Vakari also stepped back, and his scales showed nothing but the pale blue of submission. I go with him, he said. The youngest Vakari had not moved. He stood staring at Tyzik with an expression that was difficult to read, and his scales were cycling slowly between colors in a pattern that suggested deep thought rather than fear or anger. You, Tyzik said. What is your choice? The young Vakari looked at the body of Keseth on the floor, and then at his 2 companions who were already backing toward the door. My name is Varric, he said slowly. Keseth was my uncle and the leader of our expedition. I am sorry for your loss, Tyzik said, and there was no sarcasm in his voice. Do not be, Varric replied. He was cruel and foolish, and I knew that one day his arrogance would kill him. He took a deep breath, and his scales settled into a steady green that indicated calm decision. I choose to sit, he said. His 2 companions hissed in shock and outrage. Varric, you cannot, the oldest one protested. He killed Keseth, and you would share a table with him. Keseth attacked an unarmed being who was drinking alone, Varric said without taking his eyes off Tyzik. He received exactly what the warrior codes say he deserved. The codes do not apply to humans, the middle one argued. They are not warriors. After what I just witnessed, Varric said quietly, I am not certain that statement is accurate. He walked forward and pulled out the chair across from Tyzik and sat down. The other 2 Vakari stood, paralyzed between loyalty and self-preservation, and finally, the oldest one made a gesture of disgust. We will report this to the clan, he said. Varric, you will answer for your dishonor. Tell them whatever you wish, Varric replied calmly. I will find my own way home. The 2 Vakari grabbed Keseth's body and dragged it toward the exit, and the other patrons parted to let them pass, and no one spoke until the doors had closed behind them. Tyzik looked at the young Vakari sitting across from him. That took courage, he said. It took curiosity, Varric corrected. I want to understand how you did what you did, and I cannot learn that by running away. The bartender approached their table with shaking hands and set 2 glasses of amber liquid in front of them. On the house, she said in her liquid Marathi accent. Please do not kill anyone else in my establishment today. I will do my best, Tyzik said, and he almost smiled. He picked up his glass and raised it slightly toward Varric. To education, he said. Varric picked up his own glass and studied it with uncertainty. To education, he repeated. Whatever that means. Kesseth did not understand the warning. In his experience, prey did not warn predators, and the broken human in the wheelchair was clearly prey despite the strange look in his eyes. Tightened his grip on the armrest and let his upper right hand rest on the hilt of his blade and savored the moment. The cantina had fallen completely silent, and every eye was fixed on the confrontation, and this was exactly what Kesseth wanted. He was far from home, and his clan had sent him on a mission that felt more like exile, and he needed to remind himself and everyone watching that he was still a warrior of the Crimson Scale. "You speak as if you have power here," Kesseth said, with a harsh laugh that showed his rows of serrated teeth. "But you are nothing human, and your species is nothing, and in 100 years the galaxy will have forgotten your little planet existed." Tyzik did not respond. He sat perfectly still, with his hands resting on his thighs and his breathing slow and controlled, and his eyes never leaving the Valkyrie's face. The lack of reaction infuriated Kesseth more than any insult could have. "Do you not understand your situation?" he demanded. "I could kill you right now, and station security would not even find me because you are a cripple who provoked a warrior." "I have not provoked anyone," Tyzik said calmly. "I was drinking alone, and you came to my table. Your existence is provocation." Kesseth snapped. "Every moment you breathe is an insult to those of us who value strength." The three younger Valkyrie clicked their agreement, and their scales rippled with anticipation, and the one on Tyzik's right let his hand drift toward his own weapon. Tyzik noted the movement without turning his head. His peripheral vision had always been excellent, and the years since his injury had sharpened his other senses to compensate for his limited mobility. He knew exactly where each of them stood and exactly how long it would take them to draw their weapons, and exactly what angles of attack were available to him from his seated position. Had spent 2 years doing nothing but training and calculating and preparing for moments like this one. The spinal injury that had put him in this chair had come from a piece of shrapnel during humanity's first contact war, and the irony was that he had received it while saving a consortium diplomat from an assassination attempt. The diplomat had survived and gone on to sign the trade agreement that opened human space to galactic commerce. Tyzik had received a medical discharge and a modest pension, and not even a thank you note. He had been angry for a long time after that. The anger had faded eventually, but it had been replaced by something colder and harder and more patient. He had learned to wait. He had learned to watch. Had learned that the galaxy was full of beings like Kesseth, who mistook stillness for weakness and silence for submission. "Tell me, human," Kesseth said as he leaned even closer until Tyzik could smell the chemical sharpness of Rakari breath. "Do you have any final words before I end your pathetic existence?" Tyzik considered the questioner. Around them the cantina remained frozen, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the station's environmental systems and the quiet beeping of recording devices. A Palaxian merchant near the door had covered his eye cluster with his tentacles rather than watch what was about to happen. A pair of Marathi traders whispered to each other in their liquid language and placed bets on how quickly the human would die. The bartender had given up any pretense of cleaning glasses and simply stared with her 4 eyes wide and her gray skin pale with stress. "Yes," Tyzik finally said. "I have a few words." Kesseth grinned with savage satisfaction. "Then speak them quickly," he said. "My patience is ending." Tyzik shifted slightly in his chair, and the movement was so small that Kesseth did not even register it as significant. 3 years ago, Tyzik began in a conversational tone. "I could run 40 kilometers without stopping, and I could carry a wounded soldier on my back through hostile territory, and I could fight for 72 hours without sleep if the mission required it." Kesseth's scales flickered with confusion at the unexpected direction of the conversation. "I do not care about your past," he said. "I care only that you will not have a future. Let me finish," Tyzik said, and there was something in his voice that made Keseth pause despite himself. 3 years ago, I could do all those things, and then a piece of metal smaller. Then my thumb severed my spinal cord and took my legs away forever. The younger Vakari exchanged glances, and their scales showed the yellow-green of uncertainty. For 6 months, I wanted to die. Tysic continued. I will not pretend otherwise, because it would be a lie, and I try not to lie when I do not have to. Then let me grant your wish. Keseth growled, but he did not move. But then I realized something, Tysic said. I realized that my legs were only one part of me, and that every other part still worked perfectly well. He raised his hands from his thighs and held them up where Keseth could see them, and the Vakari noticed for the first time the thickness of his wrists, and the corded muscle of his forearms and the calluses that covered his palms and fingers. I spent 2 years training every part of my body that still responded to my commands, Tysic said. My arms and my hands and my chest and my back and most importantly my core. He tapped his stomach where layers of muscle were visible, even beneath his loose civilian shirt. Do you know what the core is, Keseth of the Crimson Scale clan? He asked. The Vakari did not answer. It is the center of the human body, Tysic explained. It is where all our power comes from, and it works perfectly well whether you're standing or sitting or lying flat on your back. Keseth's scales had shifted to a muddy brown color that indicated confusion and the beginning of something that might have been doubt. You think your legs make you strong, Tysic said quietly, but I have learned that strength comes from somewhere else entirely. Enough talking. Keseth snarled, and he straightened up and drew his blade from its sheath with his upper right hand. I will not be lectured by prey. The blade was curved and serrated and designed to cause maximum damage to soft tissue, and Keseth held it with the casual expertise of someone who had used it many times before. Last chance human. He said, beg for your life, and I might make it quick. Tysic looked at the blade, and then at Keseth's face, and then at the 3 younger Vakari surrounding him. I have one more thing to tell you, he said, and I think you should listen carefully. I am done listening, Keseth said and raised the blade. You should have stayed at your table, Tysic repeated, because now you are close enough. Keseth hesitated for just 1 second. 1 second was far too long. The cantina smelled like engine grease and alien sweat and something sour that Tysic could not identify. Even after 3 years of traveling through deep space, he sat in his powered wheelchair near the back corner of the establishment with his broad shoulders relaxed and his scarred hands wrapped around the glass of amber liquid that the bartender had promised was safe for human consumption. Threshold Junction was not a place for the weak or the foolish. The way station floated at the edge of contested territory where 3 different stellar empires met and pretended to respect each other while their merchants and spies and smugglers conducted the real business of the galaxy. Tysic had been waiting for 2 hours now, and his client was late. He did not mind the delay because it gave him time to observe the other patrons and catalog the threats in the room, the way he had been trained to do back when he wore the uniform of the Republic of Korea Special Forces. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. The cantina held maybe 40 beings of a dozen different species, and most of them had glanced at the human in the wheelchair at least once since he arrived. Some looked with curiosity because humans were still relatively new to galactic society, and many species had never seen one in person. Others looked with pity because most advanced civilizations had medical technology that could repair spinal damage, and the sight of a being confined to a mobility device struck them as primitive or tragic. Few looked with contempt because in their cultures, the inability to walk meant the inability to contribute, and such individuals were expected to remove themselves from society, one way or another. Tysic ignored them. All he had learned to read the subtle differences in alien expressions over the past 3 years, and none of these observers posed an immediate threat. They were simply curious or uncomfortable or mildly disgusted, and those emotions rarely led to violence. The doors to the cantina slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and 4 Vrakari warriors entered the establishment. The room grew quite of Vrakari were tall reptilian beings with 4 arms and scales that shifted color based on their emotional state, and they had earned a reputation across dozens of star systems as proud and aggressive and utterly without mercy toward those they considered beneath them. The leader of this group stood nearly 7 feet tall with a scar running from his brow ridge down to his jaw, and the scales along his neck had faded to a dull gray that spoke of many battles survived. His 3 companions were younger, and their scales still held the bright green of Vrakari in their prime fighting years. They moved through the cantina like they owned it, and the other patrons made way for them without being. Tazik took another sip of his drink and kept his eyes forward. The Vrakari claimed a table near the center of the room and ordered drinks in their harsh clicking language, and for a few minutes they seemed content to ignore everyone else in the establishment. Then, the scarred leader noticed Tazik said something to his companions in rapid Vrakari, and all 4 of them turned to stare at the human in the wheelchair. Tazik understood every word, because he had spent 6 months learning their language from a Vrakari mercenary who owed him a debt, but he gave no sign of comprehension. The leader had called him a broken thing and wondered aloud why humans bothered leaving their planet when they shattered so easily. One of the younger Vrakari laughed and suggested that perhaps the human had come to the station to find someone willing to end his misery. Another said that it would be a kindness to kill him because clearly his own species lacked the honor to do so. Tazik set down his glass and flexed his fingers beneath the table, and then forced himself to relax. He was not here to fight. He was here to meet a client and escort a cargo shipment through dangerous space, and starting an incident with Vrakari warriors would complicate that job considerably. The mice scarred leader stood up from his table, and his 3 companions followed. They approached Tazik with the casual confidence of predators who had never encountered anything they could not kill. The other patrons watched with expressions ranging from concern to anticipation, and not one of them moved to intervene. Tazik understood their reluctance, because involving oneself in a conflict with Vrakari was rarely worth the cost. The scarred warrior stopped in front of his table and looked down at him with all 4 arms crossed over his chest. "Human," he said in heavily accented Galactic Common, "you sit in chair for weak ones." "Yes," Tazik replied calmly. "I do." The Vrakari scales flickered orange with irritation at the simple response. "On Vrikar, we do not let broken ones live," he continued. "It is mercy to end suffering of those who cannot fight." "I appreciate the cultural lesson," Tazik said, "but I am comfortable with my situation." The 3 younger Vrakari spread out around the table and blocked any possible escape route, and Tazik noted their positions without moving his head. 2 on his left at distances of 3 and 5 feet, and 1 on his right at 4 feet, and the leader directly in front of him at maybe 2.5 feet close enough. "You do not understand," the scarred warrior said, and his voice dropped to something that was probably meant to be threatening. "I am Keseth of the Crimson Scale clan, and when I say broken things should not live, I am not making conversation. I understand perfectly." Tazik replied, "You believe my injury makes me helpless, and you want to demonstrate your superiority by intimidating or killing me in front of witnesses." Keseth's scales flashed bright orange, and his upper right hand dropped to the blade at his belt. "You dare speak to me this way?" he hissed. "You who cannot even stand." Tazik picked up his glass and took another sip of his drink, and the deliberate casualness of the gesture made Keseth's scales flush almost red with fury. "I have been sitting for 3 years," Tazik said quietly. "I have learned to accomplish many things from this position." The other patrons leaned back from nearby tables, and several of them activated recording devices built into their personal equipment because footage of Rakari killing aliens was always popular on certain networks. Say Marathi bartender with glistening gray skin reached beneath the counter for what was probably a weapon, but thought better of it and withdrew her handkerchief, reached down and knocked the glass from Tysik's grip, and it shattered against the metal floor and splashed amber liquid across the wheelchair's wheels. "You will apologize," Kaseth snarled, "for contaminating this station with your weakness, and then maybe I let you live long enough to crawl back to your ship." Tysik looked at the broken glass, and then up at the Rakari warrior, and his expression did not change. "No," he said, simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge, and Kaseth's companions shifted their weight and prepared for violence, and the other patrons held their breath. Kaseth grabbed the armrest of the wheelchair with his lower left hand and leaned down until his scarred face was inches from Tysik's. "Then you will die sitting in your little chair," he whispered, "and no one will remember you existed." Tysik met his eyes, and something in his gaze made Kaseth hesitate for just a fraction of a second. It was not fear that the Rakari saw there. It was patience. "You should have stayed at your table," Tysik said softly, "but I suppose it is too late for that now."